What's up, dogs? Canon just dropped their 14-35 f4, and this is the more affordable, faster, less versatile alternative. This lens has been in my bag for 6 months, so I've been holding out on you. I recently rented the Canon 85mm and figured it was past time to spill the beans on another one of these affordable RF primes. And that's affordable in the context of Canon RF, obviously. Today, let's do the good, the bad, we'll skip the ugly, and do will I keep it? If you're used to one of the flagship RF primes, this is going to be a welcome reduction in both size and weight. It's a bit heavier than the RF 35mm macro for comparison, and almost the exact same weight as the Samyang or Canon 85mm prime. The front element is a good bit wider than the mounting width, but it still feels pretty compact. It's one of just several lenses that feels balanced on the tiny RP as well, although it still is a little front heavy. I can't personally speak to the real estate side of things, and I'm still fairly novice at astrophotography. Astro is one of the types of photography that I wish I was practicing more frequently, but that is really why I picked this lens up. I wanted something to be able to shoot the Milky Way and practice that type of shooting. I figured if I was going to rent it multiple times on multiple trips, then I might as well purchase it and resell later if I wanted to, especially since timing the weather, timing the new moon, and potentially timing that for a weekend trip is very tough. Even more so when you blow up your sleep schedule trying to chase those stars. Because the RF lens ecosystem is still so new, this is really the only lens at the intersection of wide, fast, and affordable. You could go tighter and argue that the 35mm could be good for Astro, but it's not going to perform nearly as well around the edges of your frame. This lens focuses at about 8 inches, which seems especially close, but it's one of the features that makes it pretty cool. Because everything in front of it starts falling away so quickly, you can get some interesting perspectives. The focal length of 14mm is so wide, this lens can have some niche video uses as well. For example, to fight the crop factor that the RP has in 4K, if you throw this 14mm on, you can still use the digital image stabilization from that camera with the 4K crop and still effectively vlog with it if you wanted to. And for top-down shots, minus the negative of some distortion, you won't have to have your camera too far above the desk to be able to get a very wide field of view. This lens is the right price, and that's why I pulled the trigger in the first place. You can even get it packaged with the lens stock for firmware updates for less than $700. The bad. The more I shoot with the Moment Cine Bloom on, the more it's a downer to have a rounded front element that doesn't accept filters. Especially if you're seriously into landscapes and use all types of filters, this could be a big downer. I wouldn't necessarily expect image stabilization on a lens like this, but it surely doesn't hurt. And Canon's 14-35 f4 will have it. Especially after moving to the R6, I feel spoiled when using one of Canon's RF lenses with image stabilization with the combined in-body image stabilization. They just work together so well, and you will be getting image stabilization with Canon's new 14-35. It does keep the lens build extremely simple though. Your AF/MF switch is all you're going to have on the body of this lens, minus your focus ring, which you will most likely only use for things like Astro and potentially real estate, but I wouldn't know. Another tally in the bad column, 14mm is so wide. What makes this lens unique and useful in some very specific scenarios is also generally a downside. It's going to take the mountains on your horizon and squash them into tiny hills. It'll make your legs look impossibly long at the edge of the frame. It'll pinch your face. Because it sees so much, exposure can be tricky too. You'll be capturing the brightest whites and the darkest blacks across a greater field of view than you would be used to. So I find that editing these shots is a little bit different. It was tricky for me at first, but I feel like I have a better handle on that now. After finally spending enough time with this, I think for Astro, I would prefer something more like a fast 20mm lens. And the 24mm f4 on the 24-105 that I have is wide and works well for the rest of my wide shooting. I really only want that speed when it comes to Astro. Sometimes when shooting vertically, it's nice to get all of that foreground and a ton of sky, but I think that's one of the few advantages in, again, those specific scenarios where I prefer to shoot on 14 as opposed to something like 24. Will I keep it? I don't think so. For now, yes, and I will be using it. I hope to catch some Milky Way stuff this summer and in the fall. I think that's probably the best use case for the lens when you want to be fast, to shoot Astro and when you also need to be wide to capture a larger scene, whether that be the Milky Way or whether you have an interesting foreground in one of your Astro compositions. But I do now have kind of a conundrum on the wide end of things. I've got this 14, which is for pretty niche uses, the 35mm macro that I love for YouTube shooting, that I use a lot for product shooting, but that I don't use all that much personally, and the 24mm end of the 24-105, which is great for almost everything, but just not super fast at f4. Again, Canon has finally provided a solution for that wide zoom that's more affordable than the Trinity 15-35. However, it's still an LRF zoom, and thus still pretty pricey. I want to consolidate a bit, but I definitely want to see what those 35mm primes look like when Canon finally announces and releases them. They won't have quite the field of view that I would want for Astro, but they should be much better around the edges than something like the 35mm macro, and I think it's a good trade for a lens that will be blazingly fast, and hopefully one that I can use in all sorts of all-around type photography. Check out the 85mm if you're wondering about other third-party RF lenses. Check out the 24-105 if you want to take a look at the wide end of that lens. Consider using my lens rental affiliate code for your next rental, and I'll catch you soon.